Bernadette, Birdie, Sinclair was 70 years old the day she sat in Wendell Ashbury's wood-paneled office and learned that 50 years of her life had a price tag at the bottom of a will. Half a century in Wallace Sinclair's house. Half a century raising his 3 children from another woman, hosting his clients, ironing his shirts, holding his hand the morning the doctor came down the stairs and said the stroke had been quiet and final. She walked in expecting a goodbye. She walked out with a rusted iron key, a handwritten address to a town in Wisconsin she had never heard of, and the slow, embarrassed silence of an attorney who could not bring himself to look her in the eye. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of the will reading, Birdie had ironed her own black dress because no one offered to help, and pinned her white hair back the way Wallace had liked it for 50 years. She drove herself the 17 miles from Evanston into downtown Chicago in the silver sedan he had bought her in 1998, the one Spencer always called the old lady car, with a laugh that pretended it was a joke. The radio was off. The traffic was light. She caught herself at every red light rehearsing the lines she had trained herself to say over 5 decades of being Wallace's wife. "I'm managing." He went peacefully. Then the small, polite smile she had perfected for charity galas and Christmas parties, the one that said, "Please don't ask me anything more." Wendell met her in the lobby. He was a thin man in his 60s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and he had handled Wallace's estate planning since 1996. He took her elbow the way a son takes his mother's elbow at a funeral, and Birdie noticed his hand was shaking. "Bernadette," he said, "I want you to know I argued. I want you to know that." She did not understand what he meant. She would in about 20 minutes. The conference room was already full when Wendell led her in. Kendall Sinclair, 52 now, sat at the head of the long oak table with his wife on one side and his own attorney on the other. He gave Birdie the kind of nod people give the woman who fills the water glasses at a board meeting. Camille Sinclair Beaumont sat to his left in a black dress that cost more than Birdie's first car, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief she had brought specifically for the occasion. Spencer, the youngest, was on his phone. He did not look up when Birdie entered. He did not look up for the next 40 minutes. Birdie sat alone on the opposite side of the table, the way a defendant sits at a hearing. Wendell read the formalities first. Testamentary capacity. Date of execution. Witnesses. He paused before each section the way a man pauses before stepping onto thin ice, and Birdie watched his throat work each time he swallowed. The estate was valued at $11.4 million. The Evanston house, 4 bedrooms on a tree-lined street, $2.1. The brokerage accounts at Northern Trust, $6.8. 2 rental buildings in Lincoln Park, another $2.5. Birdie had not known about the rental buildings. She had not known about most of it. Wallace had handled the money. Wallace had always handled the money. Kendall got the house. Camille got the brokerage. Spencer got the rentals. Wendell read the language verbatim because he was required to, and Wallace had insisted on every word. "My wife, Bernadette Sinclair, has lived comfortably at my expense for the duration of our marriage and has wanted for nothing. Her domestic contributions have been adequately compensated by the lifestyle she has enjoyed. My true and rightful heirs are the children of my first marriage." Camille made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Spencer kept scrolling. Birdie heard the words from a long way off, the way you hear a voicemail you are not ready to play yet. Domestic contributions. Adequately compensated. 50 years of her life translated into the language of an invoice that had finally been paid in full. "And to my wife," Wendell read, "I leave the property located at 23 Pinewood Cove Road, Tamarack Bay, Wisconsin, together with all contents thereof, on the condition that she vacate the Evanston residence within 30 days of my passing." That was all. Wendell slid a brown envelope across the table. Inside was a deed in her name, a black iron key the size of her palm with rust the color of dried blood along the bow, and a single sheet of Wallace's heavy cream stationery folded once. The handwriting on the front said only, "For Birdie, to be opened at the lake." Kendall stood up before the meeting was officially over. "We'll need you out by the 15th. We're listing the house immediately." Camille checked her watch. Spencer was already booking a flight to Aspen on his phone, and Birdie could see the screen from across the table. Birdie picked up the envelope and the key. She walked out of Wendell Ashbury's office on legs that did not feel attached to her body, and she made it to her silver sedan in the parking garage before the first sound came out of her throat. It was not a sob. It was a small, stunned laugh, the kind that escapes a person when the joke turns out to be on her. She drove home to a house that was no longer her house, and she did not yet know that the rusted key in her purse was about to give her back something Wallace had been protecting in silence for 50 years. She was 20 years old and bad at typing the day she walked into Sinclair and Hodge Accounting on Wabash Avenue with a community college certificate and a pair of second-hand pumps that pinched her toes. It was September 1976. The receptionist had quit 2 weeks earlier. Wallace Sinclair was 38, recently widowed, and running a firm with 12 employees and 3 small children he barely saw. Birdie's typing was atrocious. Her bookkeeping was the kind of clean, careful arithmetic that came from a Lutheran childhood in Rockford and a mother who had balanced the household budget on a yellow legal pad every Sunday night until the day she died. Wallace hired her on the spot for $14,000 a year, and on her second week he asked if she would mind staying late to help him sort through a backlog of tax filings. The office was empty. He brought sandwiches from the deli on the corner. He had a quiet voice and tired eyes, and a wedding ring he had not yet taken off. They worked until 10. He drove her to the bus stop in his green Buick and apologized for keeping her so late. 6 months later, he asked her to dinner. 6 months after that, he proposed in the lobby of the Drake Hotel with a small ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and Birdie said yes before he had finished the sentence. She was 21. He was 39. His 3 children were waiting at home like a sentence she had not yet been told. Kendall was 12 and angry in the way that only 12-year-old boys can be angry. He shook her hand at the engagement dinner and called her ma'am and did not speak to her again for the rest of the evening. Camille was 10 and had inherited her mother's beauty and her father's sharp, watchful eyes. She studied Birdie across the table the entire meal and at the end said, very politely, "I already have a mother. She's just dead." Spencer was 7. He cried into his napkin and would not look up. The wedding was small. Wallace's mother attended out of obligation. The children attended because they were told to. Birdie wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, because Wallace's first wife had been buried in white, and he could not bear to see it again. Camille caught her in the hallway at the reception and waited until Birdie was alone before leaning in and saying, in the same flat voice she would use for the next 50 years, "You can sleep in her bed and cook in her kitchen and put your name on her mail. You will never be our mother. Don't waste your life pretending." Birdie was 21 years old. She did not know yet that this was the most honest thing anyone in that family would ever say to her. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She tried anyway. For 50 years she tried. She learned which cereal Kendall liked and which one he would throw away. She drove Camille to ballet 4 nights a week through 3 Chicago winters and sat in the parking lot reading library books because she was not invited inside the studio. She helped Spencer with his fractions at the kitchen table while he kept his eyes on his worksheet and refused to call her by any name at all. He addressed her as you until he was old enough to leave for college, and after that he stopped addressing her altogether. She hosted 49 Christmases in the Evanston house. She remembered every birthday, every graduation, every wedding, every grandchild. She kept their childhood bedrooms exactly as they had left them, dusting the trophies and the yearbooks twice a year because Wallace said it was important. She bit her tongue when Camille's husband called her the second Mrs. Sinclair at a Thanksgiving table loud enough for everyone to hear, and she bit it again when Kendall's wife asked her at a family wedding whether she had ever considered that the children might have turned out differently if Wallace had stayed single. Wallace was kind to her in the way a man is kind to a competent employee he has come to depend on. He kissed her forehead in the morning. There were tulips on her birthday every May without fail. When they went out he told her she looked nice, and he meant it. But there was a room in him she was never allowed to enter, and after a while she stopped knocking. He kept a study at the back of the house with a lock on the door and a key on a chain in his desk drawer at the firm. He took a fishing trip alone the second weekend of every month, 12 weekends a year for 48 years. 576 weekends. She had counted, once, on a piece of scratch paper, and then she had thrown the paper away and never counted again. He always came home on Sunday night with a small jar of honey from somewhere he never named, and he always set it on the kitchen counter without a word. She had stopped asking what the honey was for some time around the 15th year of their marriage. The jars accumulated in the back of the pantry like a quiet archive of all the questions she had decided not to ask. Wallace died on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of cold blue Chicago morning where the trees give up the last of their leaves all at once. Birdie was downstairs, scrambling eggs the way he liked them, soft and slightly underdone, when she heard the sound from the bedroom above her. It was not a cry. It was a small, surprised exhale, the kind a person makes when they trip on a step they did not see. She turned off the burner. She climbed the stairs in her slippers. She found him sitting up against the headboard with one hand pressed flat to his chest, and his eyes already going somewhere else. He looked at her. She would remember that part for the rest of her life. He looked directly at her, and his mouth opened, and what came out was not a word, just a sound. But it was a sound he meant for her. Then his head tipped to one side, and he was gone before the paramedics finished pulling into the driveway. The doctor at the hospital said it had been a stroke. Massive. Painless, as far as anyone could tell. Birdie nodded the way she always nodded when men in white coats told her things. She signed the papers. She called Kendall first because he was the oldest, and Kendall said, "I'll handle the arrangements. You don't need to worry about it," and hung up before she could answer. The arrangements were not arrangements she would have made. Wallace had wanted to be cremated. Birdie knew this because he had told her once, 20 years ago, lying in bed on a January night when the wind was rattling the storm windows. Kendall ordered a mahogany casket and a full mass at Old St. Patrick's downtown, where the Sinclair family had been parishioners since 1908 and where Wallace had not set foot in 40 years. Camille chose the music. Spencer wrote the eulogy. Birdie was not consulted on any of it. When she mentioned the cremation request to Camille over the phone, Camille said, "Bernadette, I'm sure you think you remember that, but Daddy was very particular about tradition. We're going to do this properly." She was placed in the second pew at the funeral. The first pew was for the children, the spouses, and the grandchildren. A cousin from Milwaukee, whom Wallace had not spoken to in 30 years, was seated in front of her. Birdie sat alone in black with her hands folded in her lap, and the woman behind her, an old neighbor from Evanston, leaned forward at one point and whispered, "Honey, shouldn't you be up there?" Birdie smiled the small polite smile and said, "There wasn't room." The neighbor patted her shoulder and did not ask again. Spencer's eulogy lasted 22 minutes. He spoke about Wallace as a father, a grandfather, a businessman, a deacon, a friend. He used the word family 19 times. Birdie counted, the way her mother had taught her to count things during sermons when she was a little girl in Rockford, and her feet did not yet reach the floor. Spencer did not mention her name. Not once in 22 minutes. When he stepped down from the pulpit, he passed her pew without looking at her, and the small motion of his shoulder as he turned away was the most articulate thing any of the children said that day. The reception was held at Kendall's house in Lake Forest, a glass and stone construction Wallace had paid the down payment on in 2011. 300 people came. Birdie stood near the kitchen for most of it, because the kitchen was where the staff had put the coffee, and standing near coffee gave a widow something to do with her hands. She refilled cups. She thanked people for coming. She listened to a long story from one of Wallace's old law school friends about a fishing trip in 1971 that she had never heard about, and she nodded as though she had. Around 3 in the afternoon, she stepped into the hallway to find a quiet bathroom, and she heard Camille's voice coming from the powder room with the door cracked open. Camille was talking to her sister-in-law, and she was laughing in a low, tired way. "Honestly, I don't even know what we're going to do with her now," Camille was saying. "Daddy kept her around because he was loyal, and you know how Daddy was. But 50 years of the same casseroles and the same beige cardigans? It was like having a piece of furniture you weren't allowed to throw out." The sister-in-law made a sympathetic sound. The good news is the will is airtight. Wendell drafted it himself. She gets some little property up in Wisconsin, and that's it. Daddy was very clear. He wanted his real family to inherit. Birdie stood in the hallway in her good black shoes with her hand still on the wall where she had reached out to steady herself. She did not cry. She walked back to the kitchen and refilled the coffee urn and thanked the next person in line for coming, and at 6 o'clock she drove herself home to the empty Evanston house in the silver sedan and sat at the kitchen table in her coat for a long time without turning on the lights. The casserole the neighbors had brought was still in the oven. She had forgotten to take it out. It was cold by the time she remembered, and she scraped it into the trash without tasting it because the smell of it had started to make her sick. The week between the funeral and the reading of the will was a blur of casseroles and unread sympathy cards and the slow understanding that the house she lived in had stopped being her house the moment Wallace stopped breathing in it. Kendall called twice that week. Both times he asked about timelines. The first call was about the schedule for the will reading. The second was to ask whether she had located Wallace's safe deposit box key, because the children wanted to inventory the contents before any official meeting. Birdie said she would look, and then she did not look, because something in the careful flatness of Kendall's voice told her that whatever was in that safe deposit box was not meant for her eyes. She wore the same black dress she had worn to the funeral. She had no other black dress. Wallace had bought her this one in 2009 for a charity gala at the Drake, and she had kept it pressed in a garment bag for 15 years because he had said she looked elegant in it. She did not feel elegant the morning of the will reading. She felt small and hollow, the way an envelope feels after someone has taken the letter out. Wendell Ashbury met her in the lobby with the same trembling hand and the same apology in his eyes. He walked her into the conference room, and she sat in the same seat she had sat in the day before, alone on the long side of the oak table, while the children arranged themselves opposite her like a tribunal. The reading itself took 43 minutes. Birdie counted the minutes by the small brass clock on the credenza behind Wendell's shoulder, because counting was the only thing keeping her in her chair. The estate was $11.4 million. $11.4 million that she had not known existed in any specific way, because Wallace had handled the money, and Wallace had always said don't worry about it. Birdie, that's what I'm for. She had believed him. She had built her entire adult life on believing him. The Evanston house went to Kendall. $2.1 million in equity, no mortgage. The brokerage portfolio at Northern Trust went to Camille. $6.8 million in stocks and bonds Wallace had been quietly accumulating since 1981. The 2 rental buildings in Lincoln Park went to Spencer. $2.5 million in income-producing real estate that Birdie had not known her husband owned. Wendell read each disposition slowly and carefully, the way a doctor reads a diagnosis, and Birdie watched the children's faces relax incrementally with each sentence. By the third bequest, Camille was no longer pretending to dab her eyes. Then Wendell came to her. He paused. He took a sip of water. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses, and his voice when he started reading was the voice of a man being forced to say something he had argued against and lost. My wife, Bernadette Sinclair, has lived comfortably at my expense for the duration of our 50-year marriage and has wanted for nothing during that time. She has had the benefit of my income, my home, my social standing, and a manner of living she could not have achieved on her own. This represents adequate and full compensation for her domestic contributions to the household. My true heirs, the continuation of my name and bloodline, are my 3 children from my first marriage, and they shall inherit accordingly. The words landed one at a time. Adequate. Full compensation. Domestic contributions. Birdie felt the room tip very slightly, the way a small boat tips when someone steps off it onto a dock. Across the table, Kendall was nodding the small approving nod of a man whose investment had paid off. Camille had taken out her phone and was typing something into it. Spencer was already standing up, getting ready to leave. Wendell continued. His voice was tight. To my wife, I leave the property located at 23 Pinewood Cove Road, Tamarack Bay, Wisconsin, together with all contents thereof, to be hers absolutely. This bequest is given on the condition that she vacate the Evanston residence within 30 days of my passing, as that property is required by my rightful heirs. He slid the brown envelope across the table. It contained 3 things. A deed transferred into her name, dated and notarized that morning. A small black iron key, heavy in her palm, the rust on it the color of old pennies. And a single sheet of cream stationery folded in half, with her name on the outside in Wallace's narrow, careful hand. For Birdie, to be opened at the lake. That was all it said. She turned it over twice looking for something more. Camille leaned forward. Bernadette, do you happen to know where in Wisconsin that is? Birdie shook her head. Daddy mentioned it once or twice. Some little cottage Great-Aunt Hortensia left him back in the 70s. He said it wasn't really worth the property tax. I think the roof had caved in years ago. Honestly, you might want to just sign it back to the estate and let us deal with it. Kendall added, we'd buy you out. Nominal amount. Save you the trip. Spencer was already at the door. Just text me the bank info. I can wire tonight. Birdie folded the envelope closed with both hands. She did not answer them. She put the envelope in her purse and stood up, and she said the only thing she could think to say, which was thank you, Wendell. You have been very kind. Then she walked out of the conference room with the iron key in her purse and a roaring in her ears that did not stop until she was sitting in the silver sedan in the parking garage, alone, with both hands flat on the steering wheel and the lights of the dashboard slowly fading to black around her. Kendall came by the Evanston house on the second day with a real estate agent named Brittany who smelled like expensive perfume and held a clipboard against her chest the way nurses hold charts. Birdie was at the kitchen table eating toast. They walked past her into the living room without taking off their shoes, and Brittany began measuring the bay window for staging, while Kendall pointed out which pieces of furniture would need to go, and which could stay for showings. Neither of them said hello. Birdie sat with her toast going cold in her hand and listened to a stranger explain that the wallpaper she had hung herself in 1989 would need to come down before the listing photos. That set the pattern for the next 28 days. Camille came on the third day with an estate appraiser. The appraiser walked through the house with a small pad of yellow stickers, putting one on every piece of furniture Wallace's first wife had owned. Birdie's pieces, the ones she had brought into the marriage or chosen herself over 50 years, did not get stickers. When Birdie asked Camille what the stickers were for, Camille said, family heirlooms. Don't worry, anything without a sticker is yours to take. There were 3 stickers in the entire house that were not on items Birdie considered hers. The grandfather clock in the foyer, the dining room set she had bought in 1991, the cedar chest at the foot of the bed where she kept her mother's quilts. She did not argue. Arguing required energy, and she was running out of energy the way a flashlight runs out of batteries, slowly at first, and then all at once. Spencer came on the 7th day with a moving company to pack up Wallace's study. They removed boxes for 6 hours. Birdie sat on the back porch with a cup of tea and did not watch. When Spencer left, the study was empty except for the desk and the locked closet at the back, and Spencer told her on his way out that the locksmith would be by on Monday to handle the closet. He said it the way you mention a small errand to a house guest you have already mentally evicted. The locksmith came. The closet was empty. Birdie did not know what they had been hoping to find. The nights were worse than the days. She slept in the guest bedroom because the master bed felt obscene without Wallace in it, and she lay awake doing math she did not want to do. 70 years old. 43 years since she had drawn a paycheck. A property in Wisconsin that her stepdaughter had described as a collapsed cottage. She tried to picture it and could only picture the worst version. A sagging roof, a kitchen full of mice, a foundation rotted through. She tried to picture selling it and could not imagine anyone buying. She tried to picture herself at 75, at 80, and the picture went dark before it finished forming. On the 20th day, she overheard Camille on the phone in the dining room. Birdie was in the pantry sorting through canned goods, deciding which ones to take and which ones to leave, and the dining room door had been left ajar. Camille was talking to someone, possibly her husband, possibly a friend. Honestly, the kindest thing Daddy did was give her the Wisconsin place. At least she'll have somewhere to land. I was worried we were going to have to put her in one of those subsidized apartments in Rogers Park. Can you imagine? At her age? A pause. No, she's fine. She's not even crying anymore. I think she's just relieved it's over. Birdie put down the can of tomatoes she had been holding. She stood very still in the pantry for a long minute, and what she felt was not rage. Rage required a future to project itself into. What she felt was a quiet, clean clarity, the way the air feels the morning after a long fever breaks. On the 29th day, she packed 2 suitcases. One held clothes. The other held the things she could not leave behind: her mother's quilts from the cedar chest, a photo album from before the marriage, a wooden recipe box her grandmother had carved, the cream-colored wedding dress she had sewn herself in 1977 and never thrown away. She left everything else. 50 years of accumulated household, and she walked away from it the way a person walks away from a hotel room. Kendall arrived at 9 on the 30th morning with a moving truck and a set of keys to take possession. He stood on the front steps with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her load her suitcases into the silver sedan. He did not offer to help. When she was finished, he said, "Drive safe, Bernadette. Let us know when you get there." He used her full name the way he had used it for 50 years, the small daily refusal to call her anything else. She drove north on I-94 through Milwaukee, through Madison, and then west and north again on smaller and smaller highways. The cities thinned into towns, and the towns thinned into farmland, and the farmland thinned into pine woods. 5.5 hours into the drive, the GPS sent her off the state highway onto a county road, and the county road narrowed into a strip of cracked asphalt that wound between 2 long blue lakes she did not yet know the names of. The afternoon light came down through the pines in long slanted bars, and Birdie noticed that for the first time in a month, her hands had stopped trembling on the steering wheel. The sign at the edge of town said, "Welcome to Tamarack Bay, population 1,847. She slowed the car. An old man in a green jacket lifted his hand in a wave from the sidewalk. He was waving at her. The waving man was the first of them. By the time Birdie had driven another 2 blocks down the main street of Tamarack Bay, 3 more people had lifted hands at her car. A woman sweeping the porch of a hardware store. A teenage boy on a bicycle who slowed down and looked directly at her windshield as she passed. An old woman in a gardening apron who set down her clippers and stood very still on the sidewalk, watching the silver sedan roll past with an expression Birdie could not read. They were not strangers reacting to a stranger. They were people who knew, in the specific way people in small towns know things, that the woman in the silver sedan was the woman they had been waiting for. The GPS turned her off the main street onto Pinewood Cove Road. The pavement gave out after a quarter mile, and the road became hard-packed dirt running under a canopy of white pines so tall that the light came through in thin green columns. She drove slowly because the suspension on the sedan was not built for this kind of road, and after about a mile the trees opened up and she saw the lake. Lake Whitestone was longer than she had expected, and the color of slate under the late afternoon sky. A long wooden dock ran out from the shore, freshly stained, with a small boathouse at the end of it. The lawn between the road and the water was clipped and green. There were planters of late chrysanthemums on either side of the front path, white and rust-colored, the kind a person puts out in October when they want a house to feel lived in. The house itself was nothing like what Camille had described. It was a single-story log home with a fieldstone chimney and a screened-in porch that ran the full length of the lake-facing side. The logs had been recently oiled. The roof was new. There was a bird feeder hanging from the eaves with seed in it, and the seed was fresh. Birdie sat in the car for a long time with her hands on the wheel, because the picture in front of her did not match any of the pictures she had been holding in her head, and she needed a minute for the old pictures to clear out. A woman was walking up the dirt road from the direction of town. She was Birdie's age, broad-shouldered, in a navy windbreaker and rubber boots, carrying a wicker basket with a checkered cloth folded over the top. She came right up to the driver's side window and tapped on it once with the back of her knuckle. Birdie rolled the window down. "You'd be Birdie," the woman said. It was not a question. Her voice was warm and weathered and carried the faint flat vowels of the upper Midwest. "I'm Esther Brightman. I run the general store. Wallace told me you'd be coming. He said it would be October, and he was right almost to the day." Birdie opened her mouth and found that nothing came out. Esther seemed to understand. She set the basket on the hood of the car and waited, the way a person waits for a deer to decide whether to come closer. Take your time, honey. I've been bringing groceries up here every Sunday for 31 years. I've got nowhere to be. It was the 31 years that did it. Birdie got out of the car slowly, her knees stiff from the drive, and stood on the gravel looking at this woman she had never met, who had apparently been buying her husband's groceries for 3 decades. You knew him, Birdie said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it. I knew him better than most folks knew him in Chicago, I'd guess. He came up the second weekend of every month like clockwork. Stayed Friday to Sunday. Took his coffee black. Took his pancakes with the blueberry compote my mother used to make, came to the Methodist church on Sunday morning, and sat in the third pew on the right. He talked about you every single visit, Birdie. Every one. Birdie put a hand on the hood of the car to steady herself. He kept the house up himself for the first 20 years, Esther went on, gentle as a person reading aloud. Hired my nephew Royce to take it over when his back started giving him trouble. Royce mows the grass and stains the dock and changes the bird feeders. There's a fund Wallace set up at the credit union. It's all paid for. Has been for years. She picked up the basket from the hood and started toward the house. Come on. Let's get you inside before the light goes. The key turns hard, but it turns. Birdie followed her up the gravel path. The iron key from the brown envelope was already in her hand, though she did not remember taking it out of her purse. Esther stopped at the front door and stepped aside, and Birdie put the key in the lock the way a person puts a hand into very cold water. It turned. The door swung inward on quiet, oiled hinges. Birdie stepped inside, and the first thing she saw was herself. Not a mirror. A photograph. A framed black and white photograph hanging in the entryway of a young woman in a cream-colored dress standing in the lobby of the Drake Hotel in 1977, laughing at something just out of frame. Birdie had not seen that photograph in 50 years. She had not known it existed. Wallace had taken it the night he proposed. The hallway beyond was lined with more photographs. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. Of her. Esther set the basket down on a hall table and stepped back without a word, giving her the room. Birdie walked the length of the hallway slowly, the way a person walks through a museum dedicated to someone they used to be. There she was at 23, kneeling in the small garden behind the Evanston house, planting tulip bulbs with dirt on her cheek. There she was at 31, asleep on a porch swing with a paperback open on her chest. There she was at 40, laughing with a kitchen towel over her shoulder. There she was at 55, 60, 68, wearing the navy blue cardigan she had thought made her look old. Wallace had photographed her in it 3 different summers. He had loved that cardigan. She had thrown it away in 2019 because Camille had once said it made her look like a bus driver. The living room opened up off the hallway, broad and low-ceilinged, with a fieldstone fireplace and a long picture window facing the lake. The furniture was simple and well-kept. A leather sofa, with a wool throw folded over the arm. 2 reading chairs. A wooden bookshelf along one wall. Full. Birdie stepped closer to the bookshelf and saw that every book was either a volume of poetry or a slim journal bound in linen. She pulled one of the journals off the shelf and opened it. The handwriting was Wallace's. Page after page of poems in Wallace's narrow, careful hand. Some dated. Some titled. Many of them about her. Birdie, asleep, October. Birdie at the kitchen window, March. The sound my wife makes when she does not know I am listening. She put the journal back on the shelf with hands that had stopped feeling like her hands. Esther was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her quietly. He published, under a name. Lawrence Weller. 3 small collections, a university press out of Madison. They sold modestly, but they sold. He used to tell me he wrote them, so that someday you'd have something to read that was honestly his. Birdie sat down on the leather sofa, because her legs were not going to hold her anymore. There was a small door at the back of the living room, set into the wall under a built-in bookshelf, the kind of door a person could miss if they were not looking. Esther nodded toward it. He said when you came, you'd want to find that on your own. I'll be in the kitchen. Take your time. Birdie waited until Esther's footsteps had receded before she got up and crossed to the door. It opened into a small windowless room about 10 feet square. A mahogany desk along one wall. a green-shaded reading lamp, 3 filing cabinets, each one neatly labeled, and in the center of the desk, weighted down with a smooth gray stone from the lake, an envelope of cream stationery with her name on it in his hand.
Birdie.
The whole truth. Read it slow. She sat down in the desk chair. She broke the wax seal. The letter was 7 pages. "My darling Birdie," it began. "If you are reading this, I have failed you in person and I am trying to make it up to you in absentia, which is the coward's way and the only way I had left." She read the first page and stopped to breathe. She read the second and pressed her palm flat to the desk to stay upright. By the 5th page, she was no longer crying because her body had gone past crying into a stillness she did not have a name for. Wallace had inherited the lake house from his great-aunt Hortensia in 1976, 3 months before he proposed to her. He had not told Birdie because he had not wanted Hortensia's 3 nieces, who later became his 3 children's allies in every family dispute, to know it existed. He had told the children only that the cottage had been sold to settle the estate. He had quietly transferred the deed into Birdie's name in 1977, the week of their wedding, as a wedding gift she would not learn about for 48 years. The house had been hers, legally and unambiguously, for almost half a century. He had come to Tamarack Bay the second weekend of every month for 48 years. 576 weekends, and Birdie remembered now that she had counted them once. He had written poetry he could not publish under his own name because his Chicago partners would have laughed at him, and he had photographed her in secret because she always flinched when she saw a camera. He had restored the lake house with his own hands. He had built a wooden sailboat in the boathouse over 31 years and named it after her. The Birdie was waiting on its rack 10 yards from where she was sitting. The filing cabinets contained the rest. The Evanston estate was structured as Wallace had described it in the will, but every line of every disposition had a hook in it Wendell had been instructed to leave invisible. Kendall had inherited the Evanston house with its full mortgage attached, a mortgage Wallace had taken out in 2022 for a sum Kendall did not yet know about. Camille's brokerage portfolio was held in a generation-skipping trust with conditions tied to her remaining married, which she would not, and to her not contesting the will, which she was about to. Spencer's 2 rental buildings had a deferred capital gains liability he was about to discover when his accountant filed the next quarterly. Wallace had spent 30 years quietly preparing a financial trap for each of his children, and he had given Birdie the only inheritance that came clean. The 3rd filing cabinet was labeled simply in his hand, "In case they come for you." Birdie did not have to open it to know what was inside. She sat in the desk chair and listened to the lake move against the dock outside, and for the first time in 50 years, she stopped feeling small. The lawsuit came 9 days later, the way Wallace had said it would. Camille's attorney sent a letter by certified mail challenging the Wisconsin bequest as a marital asset improperly excluded from the estate. The letter was 3 pages of careful threats. Birdie read it once at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of her, and then she walked it across the room and dropped it into the wood stove without folding it. She drove down to Chicago the following Tuesday in the silver sedan. Wendell Ashbury had set up the meeting at his office at her request. Kendall, Camille, Spencer, and their 3 lawyers were waiting in the conference room when she arrived. Birdie wore the navy cardigan she had bought new in Tamarack Bay, the one that looked nothing like the one Camille had mocked. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm. She did not sit on the long side of the table this time. She sat at the head. "I won't take much of your time," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, the way it had been every Sunday at church for 50 years, but the children were hearing something in it they had never heard before. "Camille, the trust holding your brokerage portfolio has a contestation clause. If you proceed with this challenge, you forfeit the entire portfolio to a charitable remainder. Wendell can confirm." He drafted it. Wendell, sitting silently against the wall, gave a single nod. "Kendall, the mortgage on the Evanston house is $1.4 million. It came due the day your father died. The first payment is the 15th of next month. I will not be assisting with it." Kendall's face changed color in a way Birdie had never seen on him before. "Spencer, your accountant has probably called you by now about the Lincoln Park properties. I am not going to explain what he found. He can do that himself." Spencer was looking at his phone. His phone was in his hand, and he was not scrolling. He was just holding it. Birdie opened the leather portfolio. She set a single manila folder on the table between them. She did not push it across. She just set it down, the way a person sets down a stone she has been carrying for a long time. This is a copy. The originals are in a lockbox in Wisconsin and a second lockbox at a bank your father chose specifically because none of you have ever heard of it. The folder contains documentation your father compiled over 40 years of practice. Some of it concerns the three of you, directly. Some of it concerns business associates of yours who would prefer their names stay out of certain conversations. Your father never used any of it. He was a better man than that, in private if not in public. I am prepared to be a less good person than he was, if I have to be. The room was very quiet. Drop the suit. Sign the agreement Wendell has drafted releasing all claims to the Wisconsin property. You will never speak to me again, and I will never speak to you. Your father's name and your inheritances stay intact. If you push me, you lose everything you think you have, and you lose it in a way that makes the newspapers. She closed the portfolio. She stood up. You have until 5 o'clock Friday. She drove back to Tamarack Bay that afternoon. The release agreement was signed by all three of them and on Wendell's desk by Thursday at noon. None of the children sent a note. None of them called. Birdie had not expected them to. She found the second envelope in late November, tucked into the back of the bottom drawer of the mahogany desk, behind a stack of old fishing maps. It was thicker than the first. Inside was a deed to a 15-acre parcel on the north shore of Lake Whitestone, half a mile down the road from the cottage, and bank documents for a trust account Wallace had funded with $750,000. The note attached said only, "This is for whatever you decide to build. I never knew, so I left you the room to choose. Love, W." She knew within a week. Sinclair House opened the following spring on the 15-acre parcel, in a low-log building Birdie commissioned from a contractor in Minocqua and oversaw herself, on site, in steel-toed boots Esther had helped her pick out. It was a retreat for widows. 3 weeks at a time, 6 women per cohort, no charge. They came from Milwaukee and Chicago and small towns all over the upper Midwest. They cooked together in a long communal kitchen and walked the trails along the lake and slept in small private rooms with their own wood stoves. There was a library of poetry in the common room. Lawrence Weller's 3 collections were on the top shelf, well thumbed, and Birdie did not explain who he was unless someone asked. She lived in the original cottage on Pinewood Cove Road. She kept the bird feeders full. Royce came on Tuesdays to handle the heavier work, and Esther came for coffee on Sunday mornings before church. Birdie joined the choir at the Methodist Church the following autumn, sitting in the third pew on the right where Wallace had sat for 48 Sundays a year. The boathouse was opened on a clear day in June, and a young man from town helped her launch the Birdie for the first time. She sailed it alone to the middle of the lake and sat in it for an hour, with the boom rocking gently above her head, and she did not cry. She was past that. She was somewhere quieter than that. She was 71 years old, and she was, for the first time in her life, exactly where she had chosen to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.